The spring of 1943 arrived with a bitter chill over Europe, and in the skies above France, the Luftwaffe still ruled. The German pilots were veterans, honed by years of combat, confident that no one could challenge their mastery of the air. For them, the war in the sky was a test of precision and artistry, and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were their instruments. Both were sleek, fast, and elegant, extensions of the pilot's body and mind. So when news spread that the Americans were sending a new fighter into combat, a massive, awkward machine called the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the reaction was ridicule. German pilots laughed. "A milk bottle with wings," one pilot jeered. Others called it a flying bathtub. It looked too fat to fight, too heavy to climb, and too slow to survive. Even on the Allied side, there were doubts. When the first Thunderbolts arrived in England, the pilots of the newly arrived American 8th Air Force eyed them with skepticism. The war in the air was brutal, unforgiving, and filled with veterans who knew the smallest mechanical flaw could mean death. The P-47 looked like a tank with propellers, a brute among ballerinas. It was enormous, weighing nearly 7 tons when fully loaded, more than twice the weight of the nimble Spitfires that had defended Britain during the Battle of Britain. Its fuselage was so wide that mechanics joked you could hold a dance inside it. Its radial engine was huge, and its nose looked swollen. An ugly round face in a world that admired sharp edges and slim silhouettes. Even the sound it made was different. The deep, guttural growl of its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine didn't sing like the smooth hum of a Merlin-powered Spitfire. It roared, belched, and thundered. To many, it seemed like another example of American excess. Too big, too heavy, and too slow. The RAF pilots, experienced from years of aerial duels, muttered that the Americans would need miracles to survive in such a machine. And at first it seemed they were right. When the Thunderbolt flew its first combat missions over occupied Europe in April 1943, its weaknesses were immediately exposed. Its range was pitiful. It could escort bombers only part way across France before turning back for fuel. German pilots waited for that moment, when the escorts disappeared and the bombers were alone, and then swooped in with deadly precision. Many Thunderbolt pilots never made it home. Those who did brought back stories of Luftwaffe fighters that seemed to dance around them, out-turning and out-climbing them with ease. The Luftwaffe had reason to be confident. For years they had fought the best, the British Spitfires, the Soviet Yaks, the American P-40s, and survived. Their pilots were elite, their tactics refined, their aircraft tuned to perfection. Against such opponents, the Thunderbolt appeared clumsy, almost comedic. German ace Adolf Galland, known for his sharp wit and sharper flying, supposedly sneered that the Americans were sending up refrigerators to fight eagles. To many, it seemed the Luftwaffe's dominance was unshakable, yet behind the P-47's bulbous frame lay something extraordinary, a masterpiece of American engineering born not from aesthetics, but from necessity. Its designer, Alexander Kartveli, wasn't building a dancer. He was building a survivor. The Thunderbolt's massive radial engine was chosen precisely because it could take punishment and keep running. Unlike the liquid-cooled engines of most fighters, which could be crippled by a single bullet through a coolant line, the P-47's air-cooled radial could absorb hits and keep its pilot alive. The aircraft's thick armor and robust frame added weight, yes, but also something far more important: durability. It wasn't designed to win beauty contests. It was designed to bring its pilot home in one piece. Hidden within that heavy frame was another technological marvel: the turbo supercharger. This complex system of ducts, turbines, and pipes allowed the P-47's engine to breathe at high altitudes where most other engines gasped for air. It made the Thunderbolt a monster above 25,000 feet. While German engines began to lose power in the thin atmosphere, the P-47 surged forward with undiminished strength. The cockpit pressure climbed, the gauges trembled, and the roar of the engine filled the sky with an almost metallic fury. At those heights, the Thunderbolt could dive faster than any other fighter in the world, sometimes exceeding 500 miles per hour, speeds at which even the bravest pilots felt their controls stiffen and their stomachs churn. In a dive, it was untouchable. Still, these advantages were not yet clear in 1943. The first months were disastrous. The Thunderbolt's climb rate was poor, and its early missions suffered from radio failures that left squadrons scattered and disorganized. German pilots exploited every weakness. They would dive, fire a burst, and disappear before the P-47s could react. Luftwaffe command considered the new American fighter a joke, and for a while it was hard to argue. The Thunderbolt's first kills came only after costly trial and error, but the Americans were learning fast. The 56th Fighter Group, one of the first to fly the P-47 in combat, began experimenting with tactics that played to the aircraft's strengths. Instead of trying to turn with the Germans, an impossible task, they learned to fight vertically. They would climb high, use their superior altitude to dive at blistering speed, unleash the full fury of their 850 caliber machine guns, and then climb away before the enemy could recover. It was a brutal, almost industrial approach to air combat, efficient, powerful, and merciless. And those guns? They changed everything. Each P-47 carried 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of firing nearly 100 rounds per second combined. When the pilot pressed the trigger, the sky ahead filled with fire. The recoil shook the plane, and the sound, a deep, rhythmic thunder, gave the aircraft its name. In just a 2-second burst, the Thunderbolt could tear apart any fighter foolish enough to cross its path. Against bombers or ground targets, the effect was even more devastating. It didn't matter if the Thunderbolt was heavy. Its firepower was overwhelming. Still, the transformation wasn't immediate. Pilots had to unlearn the romantic vision of air combat, the graceful turns, the one-on-one duels. The Thunderbolt was not a duelist. It was a battering ram. It wasn't about finesse, but about power. And slowly, its pilots began to love it for that reason. They realized they could take damage that would destroy any other fighter and still limp home. They learned that at high altitudes, their bulky companion became a predator. German pilots, meanwhile, started noticing something unsettling. The P-47s they had mocked weren't going away. They were faster in dives, tougher to kill, and flying higher than before. A few lucky hits no longer brought them down. The Americans were coming back, again and again. Some Luftwaffe pilots started to admit privately that the new fighter might be more dangerous than it looked. In those early encounters, American pilots faced a steep learning curve. The European skies were unlike anything they had trained for. There was flak from below, clouds that hid death above, and enemy fighters that appeared like ghosts out of the sun. Yet with every mission they learned, and the Thunderbolt began to show its true nature. Beneath its bulk was balance. Beneath its weight was strength. Beneath its mockery was a machine that refused to die. By late summer of 1943, the laughter among the Luftwaffe had begun to fade. The flying milk bottle was still heavy and ungainly, but now it was appearing more often, in greater numbers, higher up, and staying longer over enemy territory. German ground troops began to report a new, unnerving sound, a distant thunder that grew louder and louder until the sky filled with the shimmering bulk of silver wings. The sound was different from the sharp snarl of the Spitfire or the scream of a Messerschmitt. It was heavier, deeper, and more relentless. When the Thunderbolts came, they came in force, and they stayed until the job was done. The mockery had turned to grudging respect, though few on either side yet understood what was coming. The Thunderbolt was still evolving, its tactics still being written in the cold air above Europe. It had started as a joke, a lumbering giant too clumsy to survive, but the war had a way of stripping away illusions. The P-47 would soon prove that brute strength, when guided by will and ingenuity, could be just as deadly as elegance. The Americans had brought something new to the air war, a fighter built not for glory, but for victory. And as 1943 drew to a close, the Luftwaffe was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The flying milk bottle was no longer a punchline. It was becoming a prophecy. The thunder was only beginning to roll. The laughter had long since faded by the time the Thunderbolt entered its true baptism of fire. What began as a mechanical curiosity had turned into a machine of war that demanded respect, not through elegance, but through endurance and raw power. By late 1943, American pilots were beginning to understand the beast they flew. The sky was their classroom, and every mission was a lesson written in smoke, gunfire, and blood. Among those learning fastest was a young pilot named Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. Johnson had been uncertain of the Thunderbolt when he first climbed into its cockpit. It was massive, noisy, and unwieldy on the ground. Yet once airborne, it felt different. Heavy, yes, but solid. The engine's deep roar vibrated through his bones, and when the 850 caliber machine guns fired in unison, he could feel the aircraft come alive beneath him like a living creature. It was not a graceful thing, but it was powerful, and power was what mattered in the skies over occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe still ruled those skies with confidence. Their aces were seasoned killers, veterans of years of combat over Britain and the Eastern Front. They were faster in maneuver, sharper in tactics, and confident in their superiority. American squadrons, fresh to the European theater, were considered amateurs. Yet every time a Thunderbolt went up, it came back with stories of near escapes, of unbelievable punishment endured, of miraculous survivals. The Germans were beginning to realize that these new American pilots were not flying ordinary machines. One June morning in 1943, Robert Johnson's life became the story that defined the Thunderbolt's legend. Flying on escort duty over France, his formation was ambushed by Focke-Wulf 190s. The German fighters fell upon them from above, diving through the formation with deadly precision. Cannon shells burst around Johnson's plane. A hit tore through his canopy, and the cockpit filled with smoke and the smell of burning oil. His instruments shattered. The controls were heavy and sluggish. Another shell smashed into the fuselage. Johnson's hands were slick with blood as he struggled to keep control. For a moment, he thought it was over.
He tried to bail out, but the canopy wouldn't budge. Jammed. The enemy was still on him, riddling the Thunderbolt with fire.
A cannon shell exploded near the tail, shaking the entire frame. The aircraft should have fallen apart. Any other fighter would have disintegrated, but somehow, impossibly, it stayed together. Johnson's P-47 was crippled, but it refused to die. Out of ammunition, a German pilot pulled alongside him, expecting to see the American dead or bailing out. When he saw the Thunderbolt still flying, he pulled in close and waved his wings, a salute, or perhaps a taunt, before opening fire again, raking the P-47 with bullets from wingtip to wingtip. Still, the aircraft would not fall. Finally, the German ran out of ammunition and broke away. Robert Johnson limped his shattered fighter back across the channel, engine sputtering, instruments dead, vision blurred by oil and smoke. When he crash-landed at his base, ground crews surrounded his aircraft in disbelief. They counted over 200 bullet holes. Not one had hit Johnson. The plane looked like it had been dragged through hell, but the engine still idled, as if unwilling to die before its pilot was safe. Stories like Johnson's traveled fast, and soon every pilot in the 8th Air Force knew that the Thunderbolt could take punishment no other aircraft could. The Luftwaffe, too, began to notice. Their bullets, once so decisive, now seemed to bounce off the P-47's thick armor. A few German pilots even wrote home in frustration, describing the new American fighter as an anvil that flies. But survival wasn't enough. To win the war, the Americans needed to dominate the sky. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame made it a poor dogfighter, but the pilots learned to adapt. They stopped trying to match the Germans in tight turns and began to fight like the machine itself, with brute force. They used the P-47's superior altitude performance to dive at blinding speeds, unleash devastating bursts from their 8 guns, and then climb back to safety before the Germans could respond. This tactic, known as boom and zoom, turned the tables completely. The Luftwaffe pilots, used to agile duels, found themselves ambushed by American fighters that struck like thunderbolts, fast, powerful, and gone before they could react. A new kind of air war was taking shape. American pilots, flying heavier and more durable machines, relied on coordination, altitude, and overwhelming firepower rather than finesse. The P-47's strength began to shine. It could climb higher than most German fighters, especially with its turbo-supercharged engine roaring at full power. It could dive faster than anything else in the sky, often reaching speeds so extreme that the controls locked up and the pilots had to fight to pull out before the ground rushed up to meet them. The Luftwaffe quickly learned to fear that dive. If a Thunderbolt dropped on your tail from above, there was no escape. The 56th Fighter Group, under the command of Colonel Hubert Zemke, perfected these tactics. Zemke was a strategist, a man who understood that the war in the air would be won not just by bravery, but by adaptation. He drilled his pilots relentlessly, teaching them to exploit every advantage the Thunderbolt offered. They began flying higher, staying together in disciplined formations, striking from altitude, and never letting the enemy dictate the fight. Under his leadership, the 56th became known as the Zemke's Wolfpack, one of the most feared fighter groups in Europe. As the months passed, the Luftwaffe's laughter turned to alarm. The Americans were improving, their numbers were growing, and the Thunderbolt, that fat, lumbering brute, was starting to win. The Germans had underestimated not just the aircraft, but the industrial machine behind it. American factories were producing Thunderbolts faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. For every German ace, there were dozens of new American pilots ready to take his place. For every P-47 shot down, 2 more arrived to replace it. By early 1944, the transformation was complete. The Thunderbolt had shed its reputation as a clumsy rookie's fighter. Now it was a predator. The Luftwaffe aces who had once mocked it began to describe it with a new word: respect. They feared its power in a dive, its resilience under fire, and its devastating armament. The 850 caliber guns, once seen as overkill, were proving their worth. A single burst could turn an enemy plane into a ball of flame. When the P-47 fired, it didn't aim to wound, it aimed to erase. The Americans had also begun fitting their Thunderbolts with bombs and rockets, turning them into deadly ground attack machines. While the P-51 Mustang would later earn fame as a long-range escort, it was the Thunderbolt that paved the way, hammering German positions from the skies. It wasn't elegant warfare. It was industrial destruction from above. Each mission told the same story. The P-47s would roar in formation, engines booming like artillery, and then dive into the enemy lines with fire and steel. When they returned, their wings were scorched from the heat of their own guns, but their pilots were alive. That was the Thunderbolt's gift: survival. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, began to feel that same terror themselves. German pilots reported that Thunderbolts could appear out of nowhere, attacking from altitudes where the air was thin and the sun blinding. One moment the sky was clear. The next, it was filled with the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire. The Germans tried to counter with hit-and-run tactics, but the P-47's dive speed made escape nearly impossible. Even the best German pilots, men who had survived years of combat, began to sense that the balance was shifting. They were still fighting brilliantly, still claiming kills, but the tide of war had turned. The Thunderbolt was part of something larger, an industrial juggernaut that could produce machines and men faster than anyone could destroy them. Robert Johnson, once a rookie terrified of his first mission, went on to become one of America's top aces, credited with 27 victories. He owed his life, and his legend, to the plane that had saved him that day over France. To him, the P-47 was more than a fighter. It was a guardian. Pilots who flew it spoke of it with affection bordering on reverence. They trusted it with their lives because it had earned that trust the hard way, in smoke and fire. By the time 1944 dawned, the Luftwaffe knew the truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity or a target of mockery. It was a force, relentless, thunderous, and indestructible. It had taken the blows, learned the lessons, and struck back twice as hard. The skies of Europe, once dominated by the sleek German fighters, now echoed with a deeper, heavier sound, the roar of thunderbolts sweeping through the clouds. The hunter had become the hunted. And in every burst of gunfire, every dive through flak and smoke, every battered pilot who returned to base with bullet holes stitched across his wings, there was a single truth taking shape. The Americans had built a machine that couldn't be ignored, and the Germans had made a fatal mistake in laughing at it. The Thunderbolt wasn't just surviving anymore. It was winning. By early 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had undergone a transformation that mirrored the changing tides of the war itself. What had once been mocked as a clumsy, overweight brute had become a symbol of dominance, a weapon that embodied American industry, resilience, and unrelenting power. The Luftwaffe, which had ruled the European skies for so long, now found itself on the defensive. The once feared German Air Force was being forced back, its pilots exhausted, its fuel supplies dwindling, and its confidence eroding with every encounter. In the roar of the Thunderbolt's radial engine, they heard the echo of a new kind of warfare, one powered by scale, precision, and thunder. The key to the Thunderbolt's next evolution came with a simple but game-changing innovation: the paddle blade propeller. Introduced in early 1944, this new design gave the P-47 dramatically improved climb performance and acceleration. The once sluggish giant could now climb faster than many German fighters, closing one of its biggest weaknesses. Alongside this upgrade came a new fuel system that allowed it to carry external drop tanks, extending its range deep into enemy territory. No longer would it have to turn back at the French coast. The Thunderbolt could now escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back again. That changed everything. For months, the Germans had relied on timing their attacks against American bombers to the moment when escort fighters had to turn home. Now, when the swarms of B-17s and B-24s droned toward the heart of Germany, the sky above them shimmered with the silver wings of Thunderbolts. And when the Luftwaffe dove in for the kill, they met a wall of American fighters waiting for them. The result was catastrophic. German losses soared. The Reich's once proud air arm, bled by years of combat, began to collapse under the relentless pressure. But the Thunderbolt's power was not confined to the air. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, commanders realized the P-47's true potential lay in its ability to strike the enemy everywhere, not just in the sky, but on the ground. Its rugged construction and powerful armament made it the perfect ground attack aircraft. It could carry bombs, rockets, and napalm tanks, and its 8 machine guns could rip through convoys, trains, and armor with terrifying effect. The Luftwaffe pilots who had once laughed at the P-47 now found their comrades on the ground trembling at its approach. The Germans coined a phrase for it: Jabo fever. The term came from Jagdbomber, meaning fighter bomber, but in practice it meant panic. The deep rumbling growl of Thunderbolt engines overhead sent soldiers diving for cover, even when no attack followed. Train crews abandoned locomotives at the sound of distant engines. Convoy drivers swerved off roads, terrified that the next roar would bring fire raining from the sky. In psychological terms, the Thunderbolt had become a weapon of fear as much as destruction. The numbers tell a story of devastation. Between 1944 and 1945, P-47s destroyed over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 68,000 trucks. Entire transport networks were shredded. Supply lines that once fed the German army on the eastern and western fronts were obliterated. The Thunderbolts would attack bridges, convoys, fuel depots, anything that moved, anything that burned. They didn't just win air superiority. They suffocated the enemy's war machine from above. Pilots spoke of these missions with a strange mixture of pride and horror. Flying at low altitude, skimming just above treetops, they could see the terror on the ground. Men scattering, vehicles veering off roads, explosions lighting up the earth. Flak guns barked upward, sending black clouds of death into the sky, but the Thunderbolt could take the punishment. Its thick armor and radial engine could absorb hits that would have torn apart lighter planes. Even with holes in the wings or tail, a P-47 could limp home. Time and again, pilots returned to base with aircraft that looked more like sieves than machines. Their fuselages shredded and oil leaking, yet the engine still running. What made the Thunderbolt so effective in ground attack was not just its firepower, but its versatility. It could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, almost as much as a medium bomber, and still fight its way out of danger. Rockets were soon added under its wings, and pilots learned to use them with devastating accuracy. The Thunderbolt could dive from 10,000 feet, release its ordnance with precision, and pull out with such speed that ground gunners barely had time to react. Villages, rail stations, and airfields that supported the German war effort vanished in fire and smoke. As the Allies advanced after D-Day, the Thunderbolt became the hammer of the invasion. It prowled the skies above Normandy, clearing the way for ground troops, smashing tanks and trucks along the French roads, and cutting off reinforcements before they could reach the front. German commanders complained that moving anything in daylight had become suicide. Where the Thunderbolts roam, nothing moves, one captured officer said bitterly. Even Luftwaffe pilots, hardened by years of war, began to lose heart. They had once been the hunters, masters of the sky, but now they were hunted. Every mission carried the risk of meeting a P-47, and they knew that if they couldn't win the first strike, they would not survive. The Thunderbolt's sheer toughness demoralized them. They would hit it, see sparks fly, watch pieces break off, and it would keep flying. Adolf Galland, once the confident face of the Luftwaffe, later admitted, "We made a terrible mistake. We underestimated the Thunderbolt. We thought it was a joke." It was no joke. By the end of the war, the P-47 had claimed 3,552 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, an astonishing number, especially given its growing focus on ground attack. It became the backbone of the Allied air offensive in Europe, with 15,783 Thunderbolts built in total. The sheer scale of production symbolized America's industrial might. Germany could produce brilliant designs, the Me-262 jet, the FW-190D, but they could not build enough of them. The United States, by contrast, could fill the sky with Thunderbolts. Factories in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut worked around the clock, churning out thousands of these metallic giants. Every time one was lost, another was already on its way to replace it. The impact of this relentless production was psychological as much as tactical. To the Luftwaffe, it seemed as if the Americans had an endless supply of aircraft and pilots. No matter how many they shot down, more came the next day. The war of attrition that Germany could never win had taken to the air, and the Thunderbolt was its most visible instrument. As 1945 approached, the once invincible Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages kept planes grounded. Training programs collapsed. Young, inexperienced pilots were thrown into combat against seasoned American squadrons. The skies over Europe now belonged to the Allies, and the Thunderbolt was their enforcer. It patrolled relentlessly, striking anything that dared to move. Trains carrying ammunition, trucks hauling supplies, even horse-drawn wagons, all became targets. The sound of its engine became a death sentence. The pilots who flew the Thunderbolt grew attached to it in a way few soldiers ever do to a weapon. They gave it affectionate nicknames, Jug for Juggernaut, sometimes even the Jug as if it were an old friend. They joked about its size and weight, but beneath the jokes was respect. It wasn't beautiful like the Mustang or the Spitfire, but it had something neither of them did: invincibility. A pilot who flew a P-47 believed he could take on the world and come back alive. That belief mattered. In war, morale can be as important as machinery, and the Thunderbolt gave its pilots something priceless: confidence. The war ended in May 1945, but the legend of the Thunderbolt only grew. When American troops liberated Europe, many of them owed their lives to the unseen guardians in the sky who had cleared the roads ahead and silenced the guns behind. Farmers and villagers across France, Belgium, and Germany would later speak of the big American fighters that had shattered the Nazi war machine from above. For those who had lived under occupation, the roar of a Thunderbolt was the sound of liberation. For the men who flew it, the P-47 became a lifelong memory, the friend that had carried them through hell and back. They remembered its cockpit smell of oil and cordite, the vibration of its engine, the way it seemed to shrug off bullets as if made of iron. They remembered the thunder that filled their ears when they fired all 8 guns at once, the streaking tracers, and the flash of explosions below. Even the Germans, who had mocked it at first, spoke of it with reluctant admiration after the war. They had underestimated what it represented, not just a machine, but an entire nation's capacity to adapt, produce, and fight. The Thunderbolt was proof that industrial logic, when combined with determination, could defeat tactical brilliance. The statistics are staggering, but they tell only part of the story. What the P-47 truly represented was a shift in the nature of warfare, from the age of the lone ace and elegant dogfight to the age of relentless coordinated power. It was a weapon of endurance, not grace, of might, not delicacy. It was not built to impress the eye, but to break the enemy's will. By the end of the war, the German skies, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, were filled with the thunder of engines that no one could silence. The flying milk bottle had become the Luftwaffe's most feared nightmare, the unstoppable juggernaut that turned mockery into terror.